zu Clement, obwohl Clement so schön tönt, und in Genf wird sie auch so genannt, Claire Clement. Sie ist humanitäre Mitarbeiterin, Beraterin bei der ständigen Mission von Australien, der UNO in Genf, und sie ist seit knapp einem Jahr in dieser Aufgabe, bringt aber 15 Jahre Erfahrung im Bereich humanitäres Recht mit. Sie hat für das australische Rote Kreuz gearbeitet unter anderem und hat wirklich eine Fülle an Erfahrung mitgebracht und ist jetzt eben in Genf tätig. Sie gibt uns den Einblick, wie macht es Australien? Wir haben gehört, wie es die Schweiz macht. Wie macht es Australien? Schön, dass du da bist. Wir freuen uns, dass du deine Gedanken, dein Wissen auch mit uns teilst.
Vielen Dank, and that is the extent of my German, so I apologize deeply for having to speak English with you today. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here today as we mark the International Day of Persons with Disabilities to share with you Australia's experience of promoting, supporting and implementing inclusive development and humanitarian action. Australia is a strong supporter of disability inclusion at home and abroad. It's firmly embedded as a top policy priority in our development and humanitarian programs. With an estimated 1 billion people with disabilities across the globe, we believe that disability inclusive development contributes to sustainable economic growth and poverty reduction. In times of crisis, people with disabilities are among the most marginalised and face particular barriers in accessing life-saving relief and recovery support. In addition, people with disabilities have significant untapped capacity. We must do a lot better to involve them in decision-making concerning their lives, including in humanitarian action. Australia supports targeted initiatives to strengthen the international humanitarian system's support to people with disabilities in times of crisis. For example, we're funding partners here today, so CVM, Handicap International and the International Disability Alliance, to support the participation, inclusion and leadership of people with disabilities in humanitarian action, in particular in the Pacific. We also support the Washington Group on Disability Statistics to disseminate its tools for the collection of data on disability status, very important to improve the data gaps that we have in this area. We support them to provide technical assistance to support the uptake and usage of their tools, and to engage in new work on measures of participation and mental health status. We also fund a program called Disaster Ready. This supports Australian NGOs and their partners to strengthen disaster preparedness and management across the Pacific and also in Timor-Leste. Persons with disabilities have been involved throughout the design of this program to ensure that it is both inclusive and empowering. Our commitment to disability inclusion is also reflected in our humanitarian partnerships beyond our immediate region, including in our multi-year assistance packages for crises in Syria and Iraq and neighbouring countries. These packages require our partners to mainstream disability inclusion and also critically to disaggregate data. The packages also provide targeted support to people with disabilities. Now, in addition to funding disability inclusion, Australia aims to use our voice to promote greater attention to disability inclusive development and humanitarian action in global policy frameworks. In the past few years, there have been some significant and encouraging steps in this regard, and we've already heard some of those today. For example, Australia is a proud champion of the Charter on Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities in Humanitarian Action. This was adopted in 2016 at the World Humanitarian Summit. It is, as has been described, not a legally binding document, but aims to give more detail, in particular to Article 11 of the CRPD. By endorsing the Charter, organisations and states commit to render humanitarian action inclusive of people with disabilities, by lifting barriers persons with disabilities face in accessing relief and protection, and also by ensuring their participation in humanitarian programs. Along with Finland and the UK, Australia co-chairs in Geneva a group of friends to the Charter. We aim to work with interested missions in Geneva to promote disability-inclusive humanitarian action through a range of events and advocacy. An important global tool to help us all implement the Charter has already been mentioned earlier and was launched in November by the Interagency Standing Committee. These are the new guidelines on inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action. These were developed over a number of years through an impressively consultative process between humanitarian agencies, persons with disabilities and DPOs, and the guidelines identify essential actions that humanitarian actors, including the UN, the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, and NGOs, should take to address the needs and rights of persons with disabilities in crises, and also to ensure their meaningful participation in all decisions that concern them. To encourage and support their practical implementation, Australia has supported some initiatives to test the effectiveness of the guidelines in the field. They've only just been launched, but we've been funding some support for this during their development process. This includes a study on implementation of the guidelines in gender-based violence programming in Jordan, Sri Lanka, and Uganda. We've also funded a newly released collection of 39 examples of field practices which are inclusive of persons with disabilities in humanitarian contexts and also in disaster risk reduction from over 20 countries. These were developed by CBM, Handicap International and the International Disability Alliance, and they were published right after the launch of the IASC guidelines in November. The report aims to support uptake of the guidelines through promoting learning by example. So I recommend that study to you. It's available online and I can point you in the right direction. The report shows that deliberate and proactive action is required to ensure that persons with disabilities are systematically included and able to meaningfully participate in disaster risk reduction and humanitarian preparedness, response and recovery. Use of the technical guidance in the IASC guidelines is really important in achieving this goal. An additional particularly important development this year was the adoption of the new UN Disability Inclusion Strategy at the Conference of States Parties to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The new UN DIS, as it's called in short, was informed by a baseline review of disability inclusion within the UN system, which was completed in late 2018 by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This occurred with Australian funding. The UN DIS includes a policy and accountability framework for the UN system. It has benchmarks to assess progress and to accelerate change on disability inclusion. It applies both internally to UN entities and also to their programs. On the humanitarian side, the new IASC guidelines are one of the key tools identified under the UN DIS to help implement its requirements. So there is a good synergy between these initiatives. Australia is pleased to support the initial implementation of UN DIS through our funding to the UN Partnership on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And we're now working to encourage our UN partners to implement the UN DIS and to proactively enhance disability inclusion in both their organisations and also their programs. While these are significant achievements, we know that there is much more to do to promote the rights and needs of people with disabilities in both development and humanitarian action, both individually and collectively. Through critical evaluations of our own programs and priorities, Australia seeks to improve our own efforts on disability inclusion. However, we will only be able to achieve a truly transformative global change by working with other stakeholders, including states, donors, development and humanitarian agencies, and critically, people with disabilities themselves and their representative organisations. Australia would welcome Switzerland's efforts in helping to ensure implementation of all of these global frameworks and tools, and in prioritising disability inclusion in its own development and humanitarian work. As we do on so many humanitarian priorities, we look forward to working constructively together to achieve more effective development and humanitarian action that truly leaves no one behind. Thank you.